Well, I am going to now bring up Larry. Again, thank you, Larry, who is going to take a few minutes and introduce our speaker tonight, John Stonestreet.
Well, Barb, I have just had a few opportunities to get to know John, but in those times I've come to respect him incredibly. I just believe that we are so privileged tonight. John is one of the leading voices, if not the leading voice in America, on cultural issues from a Christian perspective. He's the president of the Colson Center. He speaks daily on Breakpoint. You can hear him there. And if you listen to him, I'm sure that you'll agree with me that God has greatly gifted him with an incredible mind in things related to scripture and related to culture and how those two intersect, and great communicator too as well. And it's just a blessing to be able to tell everybody, you get to hear John Stonestreet tonight. We're just so glad to have him here. John, come on up. Let's chat for a second as you come on. Hey, brother, I'm really glad to have you on the program tonight.
Well, Larry, it's so good to see you. I love what you hear me anytime we're together singing the praises of the Legacy Coalition. What you're doing is so important. I was really looking forward to being with you guys in person in Birmingham.
That's what you do. That's what you do, John.
And anyway, I'm a huge fan. Love what you guys are doing. It's so good to be here with you.
Yeah, well, good. Well, I'll just turn it over to you in a minute. You want to have us put the slide of your family up? You want to start there and then jump right into it?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, we'll do that, and you take it from here. I'm gonna jump off the video.
All right. Well, great. Well, thanks so much. There's my beautiful family, as everyone can see. My wife Sarah there to my right, as my good friend Craig told me the moment he met Sarah is, buddy, you outkicked your punt coverage, which was clearly the case. And we are just blessed to have 4 children. Abigail's 15, Anna's 13, and Allie is 11. And there's a sizable gap between Allie and the caboose, who's Hunter, who's 3 years old, which is really a lot of fun. He's a great kid. And so that's really our life. Well, listen, as the dad of 4 children, I can tell you this: the reason that I wrote the book that I did are those 4 kids. If you were to ask my co-author Brett Kunkel why he chose to jump into the writing of the book, A Practical Guide to Culture, he would say that he had 5 reasons, and those 5 reasons are his 5 kids. And my 4 reasons for jumping into the book are my 4 kids. And I spend every day thinking and writing and commenting on something happening in culture. But as we all know, it's a completely different sort of thing when the key question has to do with our own children. How is it that we can help them navigate these really choppy cultural waters? That's really my topic tonight, is understanding your grandchildren's world and how to help them navigate it. As a dad, I want my kids to know God. I want them to love God. I want them to follow God. And that would be hard enough if the only thing they had to deal with, the only thing I had to navigate around in that process was their own, independent thinking and sinful nature. I learned that really early as a young dad. I remember I was traveling once, and my oldest daughter at the time was probably just 3 years old, which means my second daughter was just 1. And my wife was putting them to bed, and on the way out of the room, my oldest daughter leaned back in the room of her little sister and said, "God will be with you tonight, Anna. God will be with you," which was super sweet. But then she turned around to my wife and said, "Mommy, I told Anna that God would be with her, and the other God will be with me." And I thought, oh no, I work for Chuck Colson, and my daughter is a polytheist. Like, how did this even happen? Well, obviously it was just her own thinking about God. But anyone that's been paying attention, and of course we all have, know something very important, which is that there's a lot more that we have to navigate around. There's a lot more challenges that our children and our grandchildren have to navigate around. And and the speed at which some of these issues come at us, the speed at which things have changed in our culture, is absolutely dramatic. I don't know if anyone else is more than a little dizzy about how quickly things went from being unthinkable to being unquestionable. Um, that's the world in which we live. But some of you actually have felt this at a different level. Um, in other words, the challenges in particular of the last few years in our culture and have drawn such a hard, fast line between the generations, have created such a gap between the generations that the challenges we have to navigate around have in many ways ended relationships. Um, in my own family at Christmas, there was a relational rift over one of the big issues in culture over the last couple months, one that actually ended up in many ways dividing the family. Some of you, I hear from you. You email me. I talk to you at various events, many times at Legacy Coalition events, and you tell me about, my kid will let me see my grandchildren, but only on certain terms, or they've forbidden me to talk about God, or they've forbidden me to talk about anything else. I mean, we could probably point out the big three issues recently that have separated grandparents from grandchildren, usually via the children, in the middle. And that is technology, sexuality, and politics. Those three things have proven to be extremely divisive. And I get this. So before we look at some of the specific cultural things that I think we need to understand to really make sense of the world, what I want to do is I want to introduce something that I think is extremely important for us to remember. You see, as Christians, whenever we look at the changing culture around us, we must do so as Christians. Now, here's what I mean by that. We need to learn how to keep straight the story and the moment. I think this is a challenge for Christians in any time and in any place. Our brothers and sisters right now in Nigeria, who are facing incredible persecution at the hands of Islamic militants, our brothers and sisters in China that are facing increased state surveillance, our brothers and sisters in times past, and us, we have to know what it means to keep straight the story and the moment. Here's what I mean. In the pages of Scripture, God has given us the story. If you see the Bible as a whole big picture of the universe, which starts in Genesis, right, in the beginning, and goes all the way to Revelation, which is the new beginning, and that's the story of the Bible, right? The story from the beginning to the new beginning, from the heavens and earth to the new heavens and new earth, from the garden to the city. That's the story. That's the story God has given us. But we live in a cultural moment. Now, I'm not saying that cultural moment isn't important. I mean, our cultural moment right now, we are making some decisions with incredible gravity. We are deciding, Scripture says, woe to those who call right wrong and wrong right. To do that at a cultural level is even more astonishing. And that's one of the features of the cultural moment. So our cultural moment has incredible importance to it. But don't forget, it's just that, it's a moment. The temptation, especially when the moment is so chaotic, is to stand in the moment and then rethink the story. A few years ago, I wrote a book on the topic of same-sex marriage with my good friend Sean McDowell. This was before the Supreme Court forced same-sex marriage on the United States. And he and I were trying to help the church navigate this challenge. And people often ask me, why would you write a book on same-sex marriage? And I always say, well, we were hoping to make some more friends. Just kidding. Anyway, I remember interviewing a pastor who had on the state level done some work to try to pass a state level piece of legislation that would define marriages between one man and one woman for life. And he was able to do that before a judge just kind of flipped it on its head. And, he was really in great despair. And I understand he was a fighter. He had tried his best to stop that. And he looked at me in great despair and said, John, it's over. We've lost. Now, I know where it was coming from, but you see what he was doing is he was standing in the moment where things seemed chaotic and unstable. Maybe some of us feel like that from the last several weeks. Last week, I had the privilege of having dinner with a godly older couple that I've known for a few years, and I just have an incredible amount of respect for them. And we were processing the last several weeks in our country, which, of course, from the election through what happened at the Capitol, through the inauguration, and all the political changes that are happening. And this guy was really discouraged. He admitted he was in his 80s, godly man who had led a company and just been amazing. And he said, I'm mourning. I just feel like so much has been lost. Now, maybe some of you felt that way after the last election. Maybe some of us are feeling that way after this election. My point is the same. It's very easy to be in the chaos of a changing cultural moment and to rethink the story. But as Christians, we can't do that. We must always understand our moment from the truth of the story, not try to rethink the story from the perspective of our moment. Let me say that again. As Christians who God has graced and gifted with the story of the universe, so that we know the big story, we know that our moment is a dot in that big story. So we don't stand in our moment and rethink whether the story is going to happen or whether the story is secure. We have to understand our moment by the story. But the temptation is always going to be to doubt the story from the perspective of the moment. I really appreciated this gentleman's honesty with me, and we had a wonderful conversation, and he really challenged me more about what it means to live out of the story. I love to talk about that, but I spend a good bit of time on it in the book, A Practical Guide to Culture. But let me just give you a quick punchline. It comes from my mentor, Chuck Colson, the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, which I lead, which is where the Breakpoint daily commentaries come from, was founded by the late Chuck Colson. And Chuck used to say this, despair is a sin because Christ is risen. Isn't that a great thing to remember? No matter what happens in the rest of the history of the world, Christ is risen. That will never not be true. There's nothing that can happen. No election, no Supreme Court decision, no terrorist attack, no cultural instability, no kind of crazy things happening at the school level or anything like that, that will change that. No matter what happens in the history of the world, Islam continues to attack and pressure our brothers and sisters in other parts of the world. Christ is risen. The next election goes the way we want or not. Christ is risen. Miley Cyrus puts out another album. Christ is risen. By the way, if you don't know who Miley Cyrus is, don't worry about that. It's really not that important. What we have to do is try to understand the moment from the story. And that's what I'm going to try to do today by looking at a couple things. I want to give you a C.S. Lewis quote. It's one of my favorite C.S. Lewis quotes, which is saying a lot because I'm a big Lewis fan. Lewis said that the most dangerous ideas in a society are not the ones that are argued, but the ones that are assumed. The most dangerous ideas in a society are not the ones that are argued, but the ones that are assumed. I think there's a lot of truth to that. And I think if we can kind of edit that just a little bit and apply it more broadly, the most important cultural issues that are shaping the hearts and minds of our grandchildren and our children are not the loud cultural issues, they're the undercurrents. In our book, we use the analogy of of culture like water. There's an old Chinese proverb that says, if you want to know what water is, don't ask the fish. Now, why don't you ask the fish? I asked a group of high schoolers that a couple years ago, and they're like, I don't know, because fish can't talk. No, but because fish don't even know they're wet. Fish don't know anything else. That's how culture shapes us. Culture shapes us because what water is to fish, culture is to humans. It's just the air we breathe, the world we live in. And we don't even know how impactful and shaping it is until we leave one culture and go to another. If you've ever traveled internationally, which I'm sure a lot of us remember doing before COVID, you remember how kind of deeply how deeply moving it is to experience a different culture, because you realize that you just take so much for granted. There's so many things that are just considered normal that maybe a different group in a different time do differently. And so culture has that effect on us. So taking that water issue, that water kind of theme further in the book, we divide the cultural issues that we look at in the book into two categories. One category is what we would call the waves of culture. If you've ever been to the beach and you got hit by a wave, you feel it, you know it, you sense it. But maybe you've had the experience of taking your grandchildren to the beach, especially when they're young, and they run out into the water and you're arranging your towel and your chair and you look up and suddenly they're gone and you have a heart attack almost. And then you just look down the beach and they've drifted down the beach 20 or 30 yards. It happened to me as a dad. Uh, they didn't get hit by a wave. They didn't feel what took them there. It was an undercurrent. And just like the ocean has waves and undercurrents, our culture has waves and undercurrents. Now, some of the waves that we feel have to do with issues like the riots that have happened in 2020. COVID-19 is a wave that has disrupted so much of our lives, and especially our lives together. The LGBTQ movement and all those letters are each waves that we have felt and sensed and known. We can certainly talk about social media and the challenge that it is, pornography, and the awful ways that it pounds against our kids and our grandkids. These are very, very important issues, and we deal with these issues in the book. But I think that the cultural undercurrents are absolutely essential to understand, especially if we're really going to get our minds around the waves, because after all, the undercurrents create the waves. Let me say that again. The undercurrents eventually become those waves. And so I want to identify just quickly a handful of undercurrents that have dramatically changed. And maybe because we have seen them change, and some of these, and we've seen how culture has so dramatically shifted within our lifetimes, we're more aware of these undercurrents. But a younger generation that's never known differently, they're not aware of them. They're like the fish that don't know they're wet. So let me give you the first undercurrent. This is the first undercurrent that I think has dramatically shifted in our culture and dramatically shapes the lives of the younger generation. I'll call it the drowning of truth in noise. The drowning of truth in noise. Now, on a macro level, historians and sociologists like to look at big periods of history and give them names. So if you've ever studied history, you've heard about the age of exploration or the Industrial Revolution or an event like the Civil War. Well, our age, our time period in history already has a name. I don't know if you know that, but in 100 years, when people, if we're still here, and something, we won't be still here, but if humans are still here and God hasn't come back and made everything, taken everything to the new heavens and new earth, then what we'll find is that people will refer to our age as the age of information. Now, why is it known as the age of information? Because information now is the dominant resource and asset on the planet. We encounter information more than we encounter literally anything else. And this is new. Now, I know it seems ubiquitous across our culture because everywhere we look, billboards, bumper sticker, pop up. I mean, we're on Zoom. Everywhere we look, we find information. The average person today will experience more information today than someone who lived 1,000 years ago would have seen in their entire life. right? So we just live in a deluge of information. Now, this is a dramatic shift. You might have read, for example, about the Industrial Revolution. This was the time when the world shifted from being centered around farms, an agrarian society, and became centered around industry. And it changed everything. It changed commerce. It changed the family. It changed how we designed and built cities. It changed the way we live in our homes as well as in our neighborhoods. It changed religion and how religion was experienced. I mean, you could just go down the list, and there were casualties. Many people struggled to adjust. Now, I know we look back at the Industrial Revolution as if it happened overnight, but it didn't. It actually happened over decades. Well, the significance of the shift from an agrarian society to an industrial society, what the shift we're going through now from an industrial society to an information society is no less. It's changing everything. Now, some of us realize this. We remember those hard days when, if we wanted to know who was on the phone, we actually had to answer it. We remember having to stand beside a wall, right? But these things are brand new. For this generation, a phone is not even for making a call. It's for communicating in completely different ways. That's just one example. Everything has changed. Now, let me give you a couple ways this specifically affects the younger generation. Number one, an age of information, as I think somebody just commented, Connie, is just so noisy. It's noisy because this information comes at us from every different direction. And so we are drowning in noise. We're overwhelmed by information from every different source. But this is very important to remember. No information is neutral. No information is neutral because information, more than anything else in our society, conveys ideas. Ideas about God, ideas about truth, ideas about human nature, ideas about the future, ideas about morality. We can just go down the line. And I'll take you back to C.S. Lewis's quote, because a lot of times through the information age, these ideas just get delivered without ever being argued or even maybe even presented as an idea. They're taken for granted. The most dangerous ideas in a society are not the ones that are argued, but the ones that are assumed. But it's even more than that. Not only in an age of, well, let me just flesh that a little bit more. Some of these ideas that come on our kids are true. Some of them are false. Some of them are genuine. Some of them are counterfeit. But here's what you need to know. Ideas have consequences, and bad ideas have victims. If we have a world that is delivering ideas at such a frantic pace into the hearts and minds of the next generation, some of them bad ideas, then very often in an information age, we risk, or our grandchildren risk, being the victims of bad ideas that they've never even taken the time to think about. But it's even worse than that. In an age of information, access to information gets confused with wisdom. The ability to Google something gets confused with knowing about something. Being able to access an answer or a strategy or a video gets confused with being wise. Now, how do we address this? How do we respond to this? How do we deal with information overload? Well, in our book, not only do we identify these undercurrents, but we give antidotes. Because again, we look at the moment through the lens of the story. And what is the hope that we get from the story that can be an antidote for the challenge of information overload in the moment? Here it is: discernment. This is what Paul prayed for the church at Philippians. This is what you need to pray for your children and grandchildren. Paul prayed that their love would abound more and more in truth and in all discernment. That their love would abound more and more in truth and in all discernment. In other words, Paul realized that the Philippians needed truth. And we know that our kids need truth, but they also needed discernment. Discernment is more than just having the truth. It's having the ability to tell the difference between what's true and what's not true. That's very, very difficult in a culture. Now, let me give you one quick strategy. This is a strategy that we have found to be so helpful as a family. It's helped a whole lot of people that I know. And this is a strategy you can use with your children and grandchildren to develop discernment. In an age of information, if you just preach at them, even if you know best, which you probably do, you risk getting lost in all the noise. I hate to say that to you. I hate to realize it myself. My kids still think I'm pretty cool, but I realize that I'm just one of the voices, and there's a lot of voices in their heads because they live in an information overload culture, and we've limited it pretty dramatically. What's the strategy then? How can you keep from just being a clanging cymbal? As Paul used the analogy of being without love, how do we keep from being just another noise in their ears? Here's a strategy. We give, by the way, a handful of strategies, but this is the first one because it's the best. Do what Jesus did. When someone came to Jesus with a question, most of the time he did not respond with an answer. He responded with a different question. This is what the greatest educators in history do. It's called the Socratic method because it's named after Socrates, who, other than Jesus, was probably the greatest teacher in all of human history. And what did Socrates do? What did Jesus do? They asked questions. They asked questions. And I'm going to give you one question. In the book, we list a handful. I'm going to give you one question. It's so important in an age of information. Here it is. Ready? What do you mean by that? You see, in an age of information, ideas are often smuggled through definitions of words. Have you ever been in a conversation with someone and you're using the same vocabulary, but pretty quickly you realize you're not using the same dictionary? You say God, they say God, but you realize, I don't think we're talking about the same guy here. Or you say truth and they say truth and you're not talking about the same concept. Look, this is absolutely critical in a society where words just get thrown around. We need to stop and ask, well, wait a minute, what do you mean by that? I had this conversation years ago on an airplane with a woman who sat down next to me and she said, what do you do? And I said, well, I work for a Christian organization. And she said, I'm an atheist, prove me wrong. And immediately she said, prove to me that God exists. I'm telling you, we weren't even off the ground yet. This began a 3-hour conversation. Now, I've been to seminary. I paid a lot of money to know the reasons that God exists. But I had learned this question, and I'm really grateful that I did, because instead of giving her their answers, I said, well, wait a minute, what do you mean by God? And she said, a grumpy old man with a beard in the sky who can't wait for you to do something wrong so he can strike you dead with a lightning bolt. And I thought, lady, I don't believe in Zeus. And I was so grateful that I'd learned that question, because if I'd have just jumped into the answer, I would be defending a definition of God that I didn't want to defend. I don't want to prove that Zeus exists because he doesn't. Now, let me give you just a handful of words that whenever you hear them with the emerging generation, I wish I could go into this. We do more in the book. These are really culturally important definitions, really culturally important words. Ready? God, clearly. Here's another one. Love. Love. The word love is thrown around, and almost every time in our culture, it's used in a sentimentalized way or a sexualized way. Think about it. If you have never heard the word love used, disconnected from feelings, what do you think love means? What do you think they mean when they say, I'm in love? I love that boy. I love that girl. I love Jesus. Jesus loves me. You see what I mean? Most of the time, when we're using that language in church, we're using a sentimentalized or sexualized understanding of love, which is nothing like the brilliant words used in the Bible for love, like storge, which means our affections, or filio, brotherly love, or agape, or even eros, which is not the same as porneo. Now, all of those loves, biblically speaking, are outwardly focused. If you define love down to silly little emotions, and by the way, emotions are God's gift. I shouldn't have called them silly. They're really important. But emotions should serve love. They don't define love. Whenever we define love down to emotions, we turn love inward. Every definition of love we have in the Bible turns it outward. Let me give you a couple more just quickly. Freedom. Freedom is a huge word, I think, especially in this political climate. I wish I could spend more time on that. Freedom is not the ability to do whatever you want. If something is designed, it is most free when it is what God created it, what it was designed for. In our case, what God created us for. And that plays into words like male and female and man and woman and husband and wife and mother and father. You could just go down the line. These are very, very important words. All right. Well, there's more to say about the drowning of truth in noise. But I'm going to leave that right there for you. Let me give you, I want to give you two others, just quickly, two other undercurrents, one from the book and one that had I been writing the book now, I would have added. The other one that I think is very important is what I'll call this is the undercurrent, the change in identity after Christianity. The change in identity after Christianity. It's tempting to look at all of the sexual issues in particular and the things that have changed in our culture. Things that were unthinkable yesterday and are considered unquestionable today. And to think to ourselves, man, there has been a moral shift in our culture. Now, of course, there has been a moral shift in our culture. That's unquestionable. Things that were once considered right are now considered wrong. Things that are once considered wrong are now considered right. And a lot of that has to do with categories of sexuality. I'm not saying there's not a moral shift. I'm saying that the moral shift that we see is not the cause, it's the effect. It's not the root of the issue for us to understand, it's the fruit of the issue. Beneath the moral shift, which is on the surface of our culture, is a deep shift in the undercurrent. And it's not just a shift in what we think is right and wrong. It's a shift in what we think the human person is. Let me say that in a different way. The most fundamental, profound shift in the last 4 or 5 decades, and this comes out of the sexual revolution, has not been a shift in our understanding of morality, although there has been a shift in our understanding of morality. Beneath that shift has been a shift in our understanding of what it means to be human. What it means to be human. This is why when you and I think about sexual behavior, we think of it in terms of what's right and what's wrong. When the younger generation thinks about sexuality, they think about it in terms of who they are. You know why? Because the moment that they entered this world, and I mean any of your grandchildren that are under the age of 20, the moment that they entered this world, they were told that the single most defining characteristic of who they are is their sexual inclinations and urges. That's more true than their body. That's more true than cultural norms. That's more true than the Bible. That's more true than traditional morality. That it is the most true thing about. They hear it in Disney movies. They hear it in songs. They hear it at school. Unfortunately, they even hear it from some Christians. There has been a cultural identity shift across the board. Now, What's the antidote to this? Very clearly, ready? The only antidote to this is the neglected doctrine of the image of God. Let me say that again. The only real antidote to the cultural identity shift is the neglected doctrine of the image of God. My guess is if we went from church to church to church and said, hey guys, everyone fill in the blank, humans are made in and everyone would say the image of God. And then we'd say, well, wait a minute, what is the image of God? What difference does it make? How is it significant? And then you'd hear a lot more crickets, a lot more silence. If our kids don't know who they are, how can they know what it means to be saved? If our kids don't know who God has made them to be, if our kids don't know what it is to be human, how can they be a redeemed human? This is something that largely we could take for granted decades ago because there was kind of a sense that humans were created by God and that we're sinners. That knowledge is not there anymore. And we need more teaching on the image of God. Now, that's in the book as well, more on that. Let me give you one more big cultural undercurrent that's happened, especially in recent years. And I'm going to do this. Scott says the doctrine of God informs all other doctrines. Absolutely. I am not saying at any level, don't teach the doctrine of God. You absolutely have to teach the doctrine of God. Another undercurrent that we would mention, in fact, we mentioned it in the book, is the idea of the privatization of religion, or what's called secularism. Secularism doesn't say God doesn't exist. Secularism says God is in your personal private imagination. So you make him up as you go. So teaching the doctrine of God is essential. And by the way, on that foundation, you can better teach the image of God. So thanks, Scott, for bringing that up. Let me give you one more undercurrent that I think is really big in culture. We've all felt it acutely in the last few weeks. I think it has something to do with why our cultural temperature is at such a level of heat, why it's so hot, why 2020 was the year of riots. We saw it across the board, on the left, on the right, across the board. Now, far left, far right, however you want to say it, but we have to admit our culture is pretty vulnerable. And I think there's two things that are happening here. One is that there used to be an awful lot of pre-political culture that could carry the weight of our lives. You know, when Alexis de Tocqueville came and looked at America in the 1800s, he said that one of the things that made America unique was that there was so much other than the big government. Like there was the big government and then there was the individual citizen, but in between those two were churches and volunteer groups and states and local officials and volunteer associations. In other words, there was a whole lot of culture that was pre-political. And so politics was not forced to carry that much weight. One of the most striking things that has happened in the last 4 or 5 decades, and many people have written about this, is that all of that thick middle that made America what it was has become thinner and thinner and thinner. The family, the breakdown there has been devastating. The church, the scandals, the market-driven church, the isolation from the larger culture, the unwillingness to deal with cultural issues, it's become thinner and thinner and thinner. Robert Putnam wrote a book several years ago that talks about voluntary groups. He said, more people are bowling today than ever before, but fewer people are joining bowling leagues. Now, I'm not saying the answer is to join a bowling league here. I'm just saying that the truth of human existence is that there is so much more important things that to our lives that can help stabilize politics. Now, what's the antidote to this? I mean, I think the antidote is a whole lot of things. This is a big one. Churches need to be the church, as Chuck Colson would say. We need to rebuild the family. That's really important. But one of the things has to do with us, especially if the current political climate in one way or another deeply disappoints or worries or concerns us, like it does me, is that we can't let politics have the headline of the kingdom of God. Again, I remind us, Christ is risen from the dead. That's more than just a personal, private conviction. When we say Christ is risen from the dead, when the early Christians said Christ is risen from the dead, what they were saying is not, I believe Christ is risen from the dead. What they were saying is, whether you believe it or not, Christ is risen from the dead. In other words, that's the most true thing in all of human history. That will never not be the case again. Christ is risen from the dead. He is the King. It is secure. Doesn't mean that the issues of our culture and the political issues don't matter. Absolutely, they matter. We're going to see that in many ways in the change of this administration. But here's the thing. If our children and grandchildren see our temperature go up, and we see us put so many eggs in the political basket, then we can't blame them when they put the eggs in the political basket. I wasn't planning on actually sharing that tonight, I promise, until just a few minutes before we began. And it had to do with the honesty and the grace and the kindness of this dinner guest, or this dinner partner that we had just the other night, my wife and I. I was just so moved by the humility of saying, I'm really disappointed. And I may have played this one wrong. I might have just not. I should learn what it means to trust the Lord more. By the way, what you do in your homes with your children and grandchildren, what happens in your house, is infinitely more important than what happens in the White House. Chuck Colson used to say, salvation will never come in Air Force One. And I say, that's absolutely right. I know we're coming out of a time where our temperature was high. Mine too, by the way, I confess. But let's live out of the story and not the moment.